and welcome to this unique look at everyday life in Britain during the 1930s. As we shall see, our lives and the standard of living that we take for granted today were very different back then. Home movies were still in their infancy and film was expensive, so these glimpses of how real people lived are very rare and precious indeed. For some English families, the decade of the 30s brought renewed comfort and prosperity. The devastation of the First World War was receding into history, and new money was to be made, not just from traditional manufacturing, but increasingly from newer service industries like banking and insurance. Families like this were the exception rather than the rule. In 1930, just 1% of the population owned 60% of the nation's wealth. But they kept up an elegant lifestyle that wouldn't have been out of place in late Victorian times, while also embracing the new pastimes, fashions and hobbies. Also, thankfully for us, technologies like the cine camera. The extended family of several generations, complete with aunts and uncles, was a common concept right across the social spectrum. But families in the 1930s were already starting to become smaller. The birth rate in England and Wales had halved since 1900, a trend that was set by the upper and professional classes and followed by the population as a whole. Children from these better-off homes enjoyed a wide range of unsophisticated toys and entertainments, as well as space to make the most of them. Clothes, even for the tiniest children, were elegant rather than practical. This was an age when, for all generations, the quality of one's dress was a mark of social status and aspiration. Many women in the 1930s could still expect to spend their lives looking after home and family. The education of girls would have reflected this expectation, with the emphasis on household skills rather than on academic achievement or preparation for a career. The domestic servant was still commonplace for families who could afford it. Indeed, in 1934, 20% of all households had at least one live-in domestic, and others employed a daily woman who would come in to cook and clean, relieving the burden on the lady of the house. The pleasures of a country garden were all the more treasured in the 1930s as towns began to fill with motor vehicles and as suburbia encroached on many green fields around major cities. Even for those without an orchard in their back garden, the appeal of outdoor sports and pastimes was rising. Croquet was a popular pastime in genteel circles. The game had reached England in 1852, and by the end of the century was being played competitively as well as for quiet recreation. This was the first outdoor sport that could be played by women and men on an equal footing. A more modest existence, but a comfortable one nonetheless, was enjoyed by the growing number of so-called lower middle-class families settling into their new suburban semis. The availability of cheap mortgages, covering up to 95% of the purchase price, meant that the average skilled manual or white-collar worker on an income of, say, £200 a year could easily own his share of suburbia. and more ordinary people than ever before had some spare cash to spend on luxuries. Children like these, growing up in the late 30s, had a life expectancy about 10 years longer than that of their parents, thanks largely to better nutrition, hygiene, and recent advances in medicine. The infant mortality rate in Britain had fallen by some 60% since the beginning of the century, even though diseases such as diphtheria and whooping cough were still a threat. The growth of paid holidays in the 30s brought a tremendous boost to British seaside resorts. Blackpool was by far the most successful, attracting over 7 million overnight visitors a year by 1938. The timeless lure of the beach was accompanied by an ever-expanding list of pleasure facilities, including open-air swimming pools, fairgrounds, ballrooms, and cinemas. The trade in day trippers was booming too. On one bank holiday in 1937, Blackpool received 500,000 visitors. Car ownership in the 30s was still largely the preserve of the upper and professional classes, although fine vehicles like this 1925 Buick were perhaps more a matter of status than of practicality. But it wouldn't be long before the motor car came to the masses. The number of car owners in Britain rose to 2 million by 1939 from just 32,000 in 1907. For the female half of the population in the 1930s, the process of emancipation was making sure but slow progress. Already since the turn of the century, women had gained the right to vote, together with increased job opportunities and a loosening of social restraints. And yet their employment prospects in many spheres were still poor, with most of the top jobs destined to remain firmly in male hands for decades to come. Lawn tennis had been a source of fun and exercise for both sexes since the late 19th century. Along with golf and motor racing, tennis was a thoroughly middle-class sport, but its appeal was set to broaden, thanks to the efforts of the All England Croquet and Lawn Tennis Club, now just known as Wimbledon. Domestic service was one of the few areas of employment dominated by women in the 1930s. A census at the beginning of the decade recorded 1.3 million women engaged in domestic work, compared with just 78,000 men. The availability of servants was often taken for granted, and it wasn't until the Second World War that the level of servants' wages rose beyond the reach of the typical professional household. The services of a gardener or two enabled the family to relax without feeling too guilty that there was weeding to be done. No doubt the army of domestic servants did make the lives of many well-heeled families relatively carefree. Children could remain children for longer than is the case today, and yet their lives were often strictly regulated, with tasks such as breakfast and bedtime commonly delegated to a nanny and mealtimes treated as formal occasions. The boundaries between upper, middle and lower classes in the 1930s were subtle and often difficult to define, not necessarily dependent on personal wealth. For example, a low-earning country clergyman would have earned less but belonged to a higher class than, say, a skilled printer working in London's Fleet Street. Having said that, The upper classes stood out clearly by their dress, demeanour and accent, much more so than is the case today. Much wealth in the 30s was still in the hands of country landowners, as it had been for centuries. However, gradually country estates were being sold off, in whole or in part, not least because the 1919 budget had imposed death duties of 40%. At the same time, the opportunities for making money in business and the professions increased, which led to a gradual redistribution of wealth. Between 1900 and 1939, the proportion of adults with recordable assets almost doubled to 33%. The AA badge, still familiar today, is a sign of the rising popularity of motoring in the 1930s. Up until the First World War, Britain's roads had not been suitable for long-distance car journeys. But from the 1920s, principal routes were tarmacked and the first bypasses opened, starting a trend which has never stopped. The private motor car was a useful extension of the personal freedom enjoyed by the upper and professional classes. Improvements to the road network meant that well-off families could now easily reach destinations remote from railway stations. And there was little regulation. No driving tests until 1935, and no speed limit between 1930 and 1934. Leatherworking was typical of the labour-intensive industries that had shaped many northern towns since the 19th century. Here in Bolton, roughly 700 people were employed in the leather trade. Not a huge figure in itself, but leatherworking was just one of a whole range of industries which gave the town its sea of factory chimneys and its cloth cap image. The dominant industry around Bolton was of course textiles, employing over 30,000 workers in the interwar years. Leather was, and still is, turned into a wide variety of products, from footwear and gloves to bookbindings and suitcases. In this particular factory, it was destined for the clothing trade. The processing of leather hides was a messy and above all smelly business, although no more so than many working-class occupations before the Second World War. The wages would have sufficed to keep a family fed, clothed and housed in modest accommodation, usually in one of the thousands of two-up, two-down terraced houses built in the late 19th century. The Depression of 1929 to 1933 had hit towns like Bolton hard. Unemployment in the major industries of cotton and coal had risen to between 30 and 40% of the workforce, and this had had a huge knock-on effect on all sectors of the economy, from the high street bank to the corner shop. After the middle of the decade, things began to get better. But the traditional industries never regained their full strength, and mechanisation meant that there was less and less need for armies of manual workers. Storage and distribution were equally as labour-intensive as the manufacturing process itself. The leather from this factory wasn't all sold locally. There was a thriving export trade too, with hand-assembled packing cases destined for exotic locations. Names like Rio de Janeiro must have stretched the imagination of a workforce that rarely travelled beyond Blackpool. This company did well to export its goods on such a scale. For British industry generally, the interwar years brought a slump in exports as countries in other parts of the world began to compete. Long before computers and word processors, the mechanical typewriter was state-of-the-art as far as business letters and invoices were concerned. There was no photocopier either, so the typist's job would have involved a lot of repetitive work. Scenes like this would have been commonplace in Britain's manufacturing centres. Clerical work wasn't particularly well paid, but it was a good deal more pleasant than working on the shop floor of the average factory. Although women were taking an increasing share of clerical jobs, many of the higher-ranking posts were male-dominated. The length of the working week in the late 30s wasn't very different from today, with men working on average just over 47 hours a week and women 43. Saturday was regarded as a working day, although more and more firms were adopting the 5-day week. One big difference compared with today was holidays. Until 1938, only 3 million workers were entitled to paid leave. Government legislation then extended paid holidays to some 11 million workers, but it was only 1 week a year. The 1930s saw a gradual rise in average living standards, but the prospects for some sections of the population were still poor. Even these workers, well fed for the moment, might well face poverty in their old age, with only a small state pension to pay for food and other essentials. If unemployment struck, then life would certainly become a grim struggle. Leatherworking perhaps had greater appeal than other industries in Bolton because of the elegance of the finished product. There was no real competition yet from man-made materials. As for transport, new motor lorries had largely taken over from the time-honoured horse and cart by the start of the 1930s. But the lorry would only have travelled a short distance, either between factories in the same town, or perhaps taking goods from the factory to the nearest railway station. This part of the process was as labour-intensive as the rest, with no mechanical aids for carrying and lifting. So, when the day's work was over, just what could these factory employees look forward to? The 1930s saw a large growth in leisure activities, ranging from board games for the family to visits to the music hall or cinema, or perhaps listening to the wireless, a new technology which had spread to nearly 3/4 of British homes by 1939. Television, of course, was still some way off. The fact that war was looming didn't prevent the British public from enjoying themselves in the summer of 1939. Thanks to the government's recently passed Holidays with Pay Act, greater crowds than ever were flocking to holiday resorts like these on the South Devon coast. The freedom enjoyed by these holidaymakers was poignant, because soon beaches would be out of bounds as a precaution against the invading enemy. But for the time being, the nation's mood was cheerful. In terms of material prosperity, many families had never been so well off. Travel to and from seaside resorts was usually by train. Britain had a comprehensive railway network in the 1930s, and few families owned a car suitable for making long journeys. The resort of Dartmouth didn't have a railway station, but was reached by ferry across the Dart estuary from Kingswear, the end of this highly scenic branch line from Paignton. The fishing boats of Brixham were equally a far cry from the industrial cities of the Midlands and North, as they were from the suburbia of the home counties. Holidaymakers could enjoy watching others earn their bread and butter. Scenes like this would not have been laid on specially for the tourist, and doubtless the sight of a cine camera would have aroused some curiosity. Likewise, this local ferry service across the Dart estuary, fancifully called the Rhine of Britain, would have been an essential means of transport for local people. The ancient city of Chester would have been a popular inland destination, just as it is today, with its fine half-timbered buildings, some of them dating back to medieval times. 40 miles further north, the Lancashire resort of Southport offered plenty of good clean fun. The tourist trade had built Southport in the Victorian era, and in the 1930s it was still thriving. Despite the risks of meeting untrained drivers on twisty roads, more and more people were reaching resorts like Southport by car. Two wheels were still popular too, though. If Southport was small in comparison with Blackpool, it was nonetheless a magnet for thousands of holidaymakers, especially at bank holidays and during the Wakes weeks, when all the mills in a given town would close down for their annual break. When the day's fun was over, the family would probably be looking forward to a wholesome boarding house meal. It wasn't unusual in the 30s for families to bring their own food and have it cooked by the landlady, if they weren't feeling too queasy. Sand was always, and still is, plentiful at Southport, with the water's edge a good mile away at low tide. Holidays for the upper classes could also mean a trip to the seaside, but they were more likely to head for a pleasant spot on the still unspoiled Dorset coast rather than visit the more popular resorts with their fun fairs and boarding houses. Holidays provided some variety for domestic servants, though it was still work, while enabling the family to make the most of the British seaside. Many upper-class families continued to enjoy a life apart until the outbreak of the Second World War. However, the gap between them and the middle classes was narrowing as incomes rose and consumer goods became more affordable. One change that affected all social classes was the trend towards fewer children. Between 1900 and 1930, the proportion of couples with 5 or more children fell from 27% to 10%, while the proportion with 3 or fewer children was now over 80%. One reason for the smaller families may have been that women were marrying later, but by far the main factor was the growth of family planning, including the use of contraceptives. Up to the end of the 19th century, most married women would simply have had no choice but to give birth at regular intervals. The consequences, financial and social, were just accepted as inevitable. Even for relatively wealthy people, cost was a factor in the decision to have fewer children. The wages of a good nanny more than doubled between 1914 and 1939, and they were increasingly hard to come by too. This chauffeur-driven car is about to take a ride on the sandbanks to Studland Ferry across the mouth of Poole Harbour. Remarkably, still in business today and still chain operated. Regarded by many as the greatest passenger liner ever built, the Queen Mary was launched here on Clydebank in 1934. After 2 years of fitting out, she made her maiden sailing to Southampton, where she was handed over to owners Cunard in May 1936. The Queen Mary was designed to set new standards on the prestigious North Atlantic sea crossing, competing with the French vessel Normandie, which had entered service a few years earlier. A voyage on the Queen Mary was said by her passengers to be like staying at the Dorchester Hotel, only better. There was a cinema, a ballroom and a swimming pool, as well as restaurants, bars and, for millionaires, 24-hour steward service. However, her commercial career was short. The outbreak of war in 1939 was to see the Queen Mary converted to a troop ship, her luxury furnishings replaced by functional tiers of bunks and hammocks. Air travel grew rapidly in the 1930s, building on the technological advances made during the First World War. The world's first daily commercial air service between London and Paris had only begun in 1919. Imperial Airways was the name of the company formed in 1924 to take control of all air services to and from Britain. Early air travel was, not surprisingly, expensive. But even with high fares and freight charges, Imperial Airways still relied on government subsidy to balance its books. This Fokker at London's Croydon Airport was a well-proven design that could be used for passengers or freight, while this Junkers aircraft, with its ominous Nazi emblem, was the most widely built type of its day. Over 4,800 of them were spread throughout Europe. The arrangements at airports were a far cry from today's streamlined sophistication, and yet this was all happening at a time when the horse and cart could still be seen on Britain's streets. This Handley Page Heracles class was the first airliner with an enclosed cockpit for the crew. With its top speed of 100 miles an hour, it opened up various long-distance routes, including those to and from Australia, Canada, and other British territories overseas. excitement of air travel was all the greater if there was no engine. Gliding had started in a serious way in the late 1920s, with the founding of the British Gliding Association in 1929. It must have been one of the most exclusive as well as risky sports in interwar Britain, involving very basic technology and a lot of time and effort to become airborne, even if only for a few seconds. That's one way to stop. In an age when paid holidays were still something of a novelty, the annual visit to the seaside with its piers, shows and funfairs was guaranteed to be a memorable experience, a welcome chance to get away from the daily grind. Many English resorts expanded in the early years of the 20th century to cater for the masses who previously hadn't been able to afford a holiday. The 1930s were in some ways a good time to be growing up. Healthcare and education were improving all the time, and the stresses of family life were probably less severe than they are today. Children were well catered for on holiday, even if at home they enjoyed few toys or other privileges. Holiday entertainment often involved live performances of one kind or another, with simple props and minimal technology. Uncle Mac's black-faced minstrels were a well-known sight. If the private car was a symbol of wealth and status, then so too was people's clothing. It was normal for those who could afford decent clothes to dress with elegance and formality, even when on holiday. The choice of overnight accommodation too kept up the image of style and exclusivity. Water polo, a game with 19th century origins, rather like an aquatic version of rugby, provided fun for spectators as well as participants. Not all holidays had the whole family in mind. Children are conspicuous by their absence in these scenes, and would perhaps not have been welcome in the finely furnished hotel lounge or at the exquisitely laid dinner table. For the female members of the party, the hotel offered some relief from running the home, while the men would try to forget about the office. Perhaps an easier task when there were no mobile phones or emails. Despite the formality of dress, this family doesn't seem to have taken itself too seriously. Touring by car in the 1930s was slow, but access around city centres was often unrestricted. The pedestrian precinct hadn't yet been invented. A favourite seaside destination for the better off would have been Torquay, otherwise known as the English Riviera. By the end of the 19th century, Torquay had gained a reputation for high-class living, with many grand hotels offering luxurious accommodation. No English seaside resort was complete without its pier, where many an hour could be spent watching the coming and going of ships large and small. English towns in the 1930s provided many contrasts, from the fashionable shopping streets of the relatively well-to-do south to the cobbled thoroughfares and modest terraced houses of the industrial north. While most visitors to hotels like these would probably still have arrived by train, the growth of car ownership after the First World War brought a new era of domestic tourism. Armed with an AA book, it was possible to plan a tailor-made route, choose suitable hotels, and not worry about train tickets and timetables. Of course, having your own chauffeur made the motorcar an even more liberating experience. But even with cars at the top end of the market like this, breakdowns were frequent and service stations were few and far between. A memorable experience would have been driving across the famous suspension bridge across the Menai Strait to Anglesey. One of the most distinctive car designs in the interwar period was this Morgan three-wheeler, dating back to 1927. It perhaps had more in common with a motorbike than with the standard saloon cars of the period. The variety of motor vehicles on Britain's roads was striking, with over 90 manufacturers competing for their slice of the burgeoning market. Foreign holidays were a highly exclusive privilege in the 1930s, a time when most of the population could hardly aspire to cross the Channel. Perhaps the ultimate foreign experience was an ocean cruise. The Arandora Star was built by Camel Laird in 1927 and refitted as a cruise liner 2 years later with capacity for 354 first-class passengers. During the 1930s, this imposing vessel travelled throughout the world, with winter journeys to Trinidad, Florida and Cuba, springtime visits to the Mediterranean, and summer trips to Sweden and Norway. Much of the time, the cruise destination was immaterial. What counted was the life of unashamed luxury that the passengers enjoyed on board, with facilities easily matching up to those in the best of British hotels. But the career of the Arandora was destined to be short. She was to be commandeered for military use in 1939 and torpedoed by a Nazi submarine in 1940. A wedding in the 1930s was just as much a celebration as it is today, but for rather different reasons. Marriage in those days was a prerequisite for children, and it also offered many women their best chance of a decent standard of living, given that women's own job prospects were generally poor. The church setting would already have been an unfamiliar one for many of the guests. Regular church attendances in some towns had halved between 1900 and 1935, a trend which was set to continue after the Second World War. Education in the 1930s was dependent on a family's means. While compulsory schooling for the masses ended at the age of 14, a minority of children from wealthier backgrounds went to a private prep school up to the age of 13 and then to public school, often boarding, in preparation for university. The environment and facilities at many private schools were beyond the wildest dreams of ordinary people. But life for the pupils was not necessarily pleasurable. Discipline was usually harsh, and teaching methods were often uninspiring. In many urban districts, the horse had given way completely to the motorcar in the space of 2 decades. A small Morris would have cost around £150, well within the budget of a middle-class family. Life at home for the average family had changed a lot too. The house-building boom of the 20s and 30s had provided more people than ever with a private garden, as well as such internal luxuries as a bathroom and an inside toilet. Although lifestyles in the 30s were in some respects healthier than today, smoking was rife, and people really had no idea that it was doing them any harm. Even children could be encouraged to play at smoking. Tobacco consumption per head of population almost doubled between 1914 and 1938. Even here in the North London suburbs, the semi-detached garden provided a welcome bit of space that would have been beyond the reach of an ordinary family 30 years earlier. As things turned out, a 3-bedroomed house on the fringe of the capital would never again be so affordable. The Victorian legacy of public parks was still appreciated in the interwar years, ideal for trying out newly acquired driving skills. Sources of amusement are simple by today's standards, but perhaps none the worse for that. Most pastimes seem to involve physical activity of one kind or another, rather than sitting in front of a screen. Although adults in the 30s would have been old enough to remember the horrors of the First World War, the mood of the nation was one of optimism. More and more people were attaining a better standard of living, so that by the end of the decade, roughly a third of the population could be considered middle class. During that all-too-brief period of calm between the two world wars, the lives of many ordinary people were being transformed by new technology, which saved many hours of physical toil. What lay behind it all was electricity, supplying power for cookers, vacuum cleaners, radio sets, and many other domestic appliances, none of which would have been enjoyed by these people's parents. As for health, about 10 million people were now covered by private insurance schemes, far more than at the turn of the century. Moves were afoot to extend free hospital treatment to all, a dream which was only to be realized after the Second World War with the setting up of the National Health Service. In all, there was every reason to look forward to a bright future. Thermos flasks and picnic baskets symbolized a new role for the countryside in the 1930s. Increased mobility meant that more and more town dwellers were able to explore rural England. The rustic idyll became the dream of many townies. Countryside access wasn't always easy. Large tracts of open country, especially in northern England, were out of bounds to ordinary people. But the heroic Kinder Trespass of 1932 forced a gradual reduction in keep-out signs and greater tolerance on the part of some landowners and gamekeepers. The countryside was a great leveller. It enabled even poorer people living in cramped city conditions to enjoy space and fresh air. Children especially must have relished the freedom of fields, rivers, and lakes. By the end of the 30s, the lure of the countryside was so great that many people from towns were starting to move out of their semi-detached suburbia and into the picturesque villages that they so much admired. Children growing up in the 30s would have spent a greater part of their time in and around the home than they do today. Food was more likely to be homemade, although there were already some branded snack products available, like Mars bars that were first marketed in 1932, and Smarties came along in 1937. Nevertheless, perhaps diets without additives or fast foods were often healthier 70 years ago than they are today. Children were more likely to play without adult supervision, while for the grown-ups too, life had its lighter moments. Family roles were, in general, clearly defined. Father was the head of the household. Not quite the stern Victorian or Edwardian figure perhaps, but still very much in authority. A fine Sunday afternoon in springtime was good reason to take the family's prized Buick out for a spin. The atmosphere seems happy and relaxed. There was none of today's hurried ferrying by car from one organised activity to another. Children's lives were less competitive in those days, at least on the surface. The fruits of nature could provide endless opportunities for gentle exploration and discovery. The picking of bluebells in the 1930s might not have been universally welcomed, but it was usually seen as doing little harm. Britain still had large tracts of native woodland and many thousands of acres of wildflower meadows. People were undeniably good at creating their own entertainment, especially when there was a cine camera around. The growth of car ownership brought increased visitors to many British beauty spots. There wasn't a proper tourist industry yet, but the National Trust was already firmly established, and more monuments and historic sites were being opened up as family attractions. Playing at soldiers was something deeply ingrained in children's nature. Wartime memories must have been aroused when a German Zeppelin airship drifted over one of Britain's towns. These massive machines had carried out bombing raids during the First World War. Now they were being used as luxury passenger carriers, and one of them even made a complete round-the-world flight in 1933. This cross-channel ferry was a more conventional means of transport, though still regarded as exotic by many people. France was by far the most popular destination, while the more adventurous might be heading for Italy, Germany, or even Austria. Back home, the sights and sounds of the English capital drew the crowds, just as they do today. Many people came to London for its uniquely strong and vital cultural life. It had the only full-time internationally recognised opera house, and was the only place in Britain where ballet was regularly performed. Thanks largely to the efforts of a few amateur filmmakers, we've been able to enjoy a real slice of everyday life in the 1930s, although many aspects were soon to change beyond all recognition. Be sure to look out for the other volumes in this unique series, which continue this look at everyday life throughout the 1940s and 50s. Bye for now. Hello and welcome to this unique look at everyday life in Britain during the 1940s. Even though the majority of the decade was overshadowed by the Second World War, everyday life was by no means all doom and gloom. As we shall see, home movies weren't quite the rarity they were in the 1930s. And even though colour film was scarce and expensive, it was starting to make an appearance. Easter 1940, and the phony war, as they call it, is about to get very real indeed. Narvik, on the Norwegian coast, was about to become a fiasco for the Allies. But we are not downhearted. The news from the continent may be black, but let's make the most of the spring sunshine while we can. Whitsun, of course, was the old movable bank holiday that fell 7 weeks after Easter. It's a church festival, and in those days, church functions and parades were much more part of ordinary life than now. But war or no war, it's a holiday weekend, and when you're just 4 years old, who cares? The family are around for the day, and the sun shining. In those days, there wasn't any bank holiday at May Day, so people looked forward to Whitsun all the more. In the 60s, the Whit holiday was replaced by Spring Bank Holiday, fixed at the last weekend in May, and dubbed Wilsontide by some after the Prime Minister who introduced it. Can't believe that sunshine. Can't believe those haircuts either. The ice cream cart really is a cart, with cornets costing just 1 old penny. Half the fun is saying hello to Dobbin. The news gets grimmer by the day. Easter in 1940 came exceptionally early, so Whitsun fell on May the 12th. Just 2 weeks later came the evacuation at Dunkirk, and many people expected Hitler to invade straight away. But no, and the British Army lived to fight another day. The youngest member of this family is all togged up in thick coat and leggings. Kids seemed to play outdoors in all weathers then, and indoors there was no central heating. A bottle of beer'd go down well. In 1940, a half-pint bottle would cost around 5 pence, old money. That's just 2 pence today. Enjoy it. By the end of the war, the price will have doubled. A bit of joshing for the camera here, as servicemen and civilians sort of swap hats. Meantime, the crowds have gathered for the grand spectacle of a marbles tournament. Everyone's enjoying the sunshine, and many have come by bike, everyday transport for young and old in 1940, when severe petrol rationing prompted many motorists to lay up their car until after the war was over. Is that British movie tone news? Hope he's got a good long focus lens. For the champion, a silver trophy and a well-earned round of applause. And the real prize, a barrel of beer from the wood. crowd begins to move off. Hats and jackets for the men. No such thing as leisure wear in those days. Now, for those with cars still on the road, how about a drink at the George, where there's no doubt a public bar separate from the main hotel. Some running repairs needed here. That's a Jowett Bradford van with its twin-cylinder engine, very much a 1930s design, but actually built in the late 1940s. Now here's a pre-war Austin 10, bowling along near Burnley in Lancashire. No problem being in the middle of the road, no traffic. No problem parking either. It's a walk to the nearest call box to ring somebody up, for in the 1940s only the better off households were on the telephone. Press button A to speak. You really feel those cobbled streets on a bicycle. White painted bands around the lamppost are a relic of the wartime blackout. The stone terraces are dark with soot, but this proud householder has picked out his doorway by cleaning off the lines of mortar. So it's off to school or work, and uphill all the way by the look of it. Mill chimneys marked the northern landscape. Petrol rationing continued for several years after the war, and bicycles and Shanks's pony remained everyday modes of transport. So too, for some, did the pony and trap, and once again, little other traffic to frighten the horse. It wasn't only petrol that was rationed. VE Day came in May 1945 and VJ Day 3 months later. But the huge war effort left Britain's economy completely winded, and there followed several drab and difficult years of shortages, austerity and tightened belts. It took time for the men to be demobbed, and in a very uncertain world, with Russia's actions in particular far from reassuring, numbers under arms remained high, and national service continued. So, in Civvy Street, it was still mostly women and children we saw. Let's enjoy it though. Clay pipes were great fun for the kids. Fill them up with good rich soap suds and blow as many bubbles as you can. Out in the country too, people longed for the return of better times. This farmhouse advertises bed and breakfast and ham and eggs, a good old-fashioned British high tea. Nowadays it would probably be gammon and pineapple. The family gathers for the photographer, who has colour film in his camera. That would have cost a bit in those days. This is September 1947, and the farm is near Bidford-on-Avon in the Vale of Evesham. Family life on another farm now, this time near Rugeley in Staffordshire. Granny's annex appears to be a caravan. Hope for her sake it was only used in the summer. These young men may well have just been demobbed from the forces. Farmyards then would be real farmyards, with a flock of hens scurrying round, maybe a couple of pigs as well. It It was great fun growing up on a farm. Here they've just taken delivery of the latest Fordson tractor, something new to ride in. But there's plenty of serious work to be done, and on a hot day you need to break off for a few minutes between sessions. Okay lads, back to it! Here comes the Royal Scot, 15 coaches long. The main line from London to Glasgow ran right through the fields. Farming in the 1940s was still a very labour-intensive business, which peaked sharply at certain times of the year. It still does, of course, but haymaking today is all done by one man and one giant machine, hired out to great prairie-sized farms. Here the machinery is still pretty primitive, and it's all hands to the job while the weather holds. Women too. Hazel Grove in Cheshire in 1949 had not yet been completely swallowed up by Manchester, and the show there was a big summer's day out for all the family. Farmers from the district parade their finest in front of the crowds. Somebody's taking a collection, with the brolly being used to catch coins. Come on you lot, let's be having it. Plenty of clowning around, but not much sign of money. Graphics, very much in 1930s style, show that, not surprisingly, fashion and design had more or less marked time since 1939. For, as we said, the immediate post-war years were fully taken up with just getting the basics of life back to something like normal. Steam trains, of course, were still the backbone of our public transport. No lifting barriers yet. As the wooden gates swing open, a new Hillman estate car sets off across the line as an Austin lorry approaches. And when the traffic is cleared, the family can follow across. The British seaside is still the place for holidays. Behind the miniature railway, parked cars, still mostly pre-war, show that some people at least are starting to manage to get some petrol. Blackpool, then as now, was top choice for a day trip for working people in the north. These young ladies are dressed for the beach, but one of the boys has his best suit on, paired with wellies. Not to worry, Blackpool's fun whatever you're in, and a tub of ice cream goes down well for mum too. This family's coats and hats seem to hark back to an earlier age. Blackpool's famous trams run along the promenade, just as they had since 1885, and just as they still do today. The boating pool looks, frankly, pretty shabby. Deck chairs are 3 old pence to hire. That's only just over 1p. but there doesn't seem to be many takers yet. It's probably early in the day, or perhaps a bit early in the season. Rather unfortunately, these concrete seawalls have a strongly wartime look about them. Today, Blackpool's Pleasure Beach amusement park offers some of the most hair-raising rides in the world. But 60 years ago, it was an altogether more homely show and not to be taken very seriously. Wartime air raid precautions, or ARP activities, had often bred a great camaraderie among the menfolk, a bit like Dad's army, though this band looks big enough to be a more professional lot. It was an era of swing, big bands and the Glenn Miller sound. In Blackpool, Reginald Dixon played them all on the Tower Ballroom's mighty Wurlitzer. Seaside games included bowls, which can sometimes be taken very seriously, and various kinds of crazy golf, which really can't. Even Mum can get this in. Two-piece bathing suits were the order of the day for the fashion conscious. Colour film again, proving that the sky on the Lancashire coast sometimes really is blue, and the little girls look rather fetching. Now we head south to Newquay, Cornwall for a rather different seaside holiday. Newquay today is the surf capital of Britain. But this is the year 1940, when surfing had hardly been invented and people had other things on their minds anyway. This family had been evacuated from the London Blitz to what must have seemed like heaven, at least for the children. Mums and dads visited when they could, but schools moved lock, stock and barrel into various hotels in the town, and many stayed there for the duration of the war. A very demanding time for anyone with responsibilities, but the gulls and the girls never had it so good. Back in the towns and cities, life went on, and a lovely summer's weekend would bring everyone out into the parks. There's a cheerful and happy look about these scenes, and it looks as if the war is finally over. Again, it's noticeable what plain, drab clothes everyone's wearing, or so it looks to us now. The children don't seem to care tuppence. Teenagers in those days didn't really exist as a culture. Children stayed children until they became young adults. They seemed much more carefree with it, and families spent much more time together. The fair's in town today though, and some youngsters are feeling the pull of a new adventure. Who knows who you might meet? There's a couple of young soldiers on the Ferris wheel. Dream on. Time for a sandwich and a mug of squash with Mum. A lot of people are drifting off now. Mum and daughter aren't hurrying off yet though. Now the crowds have thinned down a bit, we can throw the crumbs to the ducks. Then home to Children's Hour on the wireless. We're on to bigger waters now. It's the River Thames, with a scene that looks straight out of that classic book, Three Men in a Boat. In those days, lots of people would have read that novel at school. It's May 1947, and all the crews are out on the river for the Oxford Eights Week. Everyone here will be painfully aware that the Oxford-Cambridge boat race, held a few weeks earlier, had been won by Cambridge, by 10 lengths. Oxford oarsmen will be thinking of revenge, but in fact Cambridge had begun a winning streak, beating their rivals 10 years out of 12 from 1947 on. Now for a rather less sporty pastime. These are teach-yourself music books laid out ready. And here's a young lady ready to give it a go. First, make sure you've got the right instrument. Maybe not. Now this is more my size. Hey, we're away! Something for Dad to get stuck into. And Mum's going to give it a go too. Daughter fills in on the harmonica. Quite a family. Out in the wider world once more, steam trains in those days were part of everyone's lives, for long distance journeys and short. The letters LMS on the tender proudly standing for London, Midland and Scottish. The LMS was one of the old Big Four railway companies, and from the start of 1948 they would all be merged into British Railways in the Attlee government's nationalisation programme. This government had swept to power with a huge majority in 1945, immediately after the war, with a left-wing programme to bring much of Britain's industry and services into the ownership of the people. At London's Camden depot, an express engine is being turned ready for its next duty. Passenger engines only ran tender first for short or slow journeys, so every big depot had to have its turntable. Down the road at King's Cross, an express is leaving for the north. The tender now carries the name British Railways. This engine is named W.P. Allen after a trade union official. There's a sign of the political times. Smoke and steam fill the air around King's Cross Station. No wonder all the buildings became so blackened. Coming up to the camera is a local train for Hertford, which will have started from Moorgate, carrying all those city clerks home. Here's a coal train heading for London town. Every household had its coal fire in those days, and several in big houses. More smoke to thicken the London smokes. This is the main line out of Euston, seen from an express bound for Birmingham. Extra rails on the tracks below show these are the suburban lines to Watford, electrified back in 1922. And here, as many a dad and lad will recognise, the handsome lines of a Castle-class locomotive of the Great Western Railway. The Great Western always had a certain style that none of the other regions quite matched, and because it ran to Devon and Cornwall, people fondly remembered it for fun and holidays too. A winning formula. Colour film here shows the shades of red that British Railways used to paint their suburban carriages. Most of these are the old-fashioned type with no corridor, where 6 people sat facing each other either side of every compartment. Commuters who tried to strike up a conversation weren't popular. We're not far from Hendon here on the Midland Main Line out of St Pancras. There are precious few green fields here today, and in fact within 10 years of these scenes, the M1 motorway would be built right through this area, running alongside the railway for several miles. But now, a railway journey straight out of our childhood dreams and memories. It's July 1949. And the bonny banks of Loch Long near Loch Lomond frame the scene as our train climbs the West Highland Line on its way from Glasgow to Fort William. 2 engines. There's many miles of hard climbing ahead. It's single track here, and while we wait in Ardlui Loop to cross a southbound train, the driver of the second engine, named Glenn Fruin, does some oiling round and chats with a passenger in broad Scots brogue. Here comes the other train. Notice the crew holding out the token for the stretch of single line they're just leaving. Onward again, and soon our train is crossing the fine curved viaduct over Glenfalloch. This railway journey is unrivalled for views of the glens and the bens. The line comes down to sea level once more at Fort William on Loch Linney, where in those days the station lay close to the town centre at the water's edge. Redevelopment has since moved it half a mile out of town. Further north, evening calm settles over the sound of sleet between the Isle of Skye and the mainland. This little ferry, between Kyle of Loch Alsh and Kylarkin on Skye, was becoming a major bottleneck even then, and has now been replaced by a bridge, not without controversy. An Austin saloon edges gingerly ashore. But it's back home now to everyday life, with kids at school and a baby to bring up. Times are not easy, with many things on ration, and toys only just coming back into the shops. So it's simple pleasures for everyone. This family's local park is Chalkwell at Southend-on-Sea. Parents were wondering just what sort of world, if any, their children would grow up to see. The shadow of the atom bomb loomed very large. The Iron Curtain had fallen across Europe, and the news seemed relentlessly grim. But what does all that matter when you're just a year or 2 old? The family gets the deck chairs out for a picnic. None of your lightweight, easy folding stuff. These are wood and canvas, the kind that could do serious damage to unguarded fingers. The Park Lake beckons for fun on the water. And there's some good exercise for Dad. Those old-fashioned wooden rowing boats were good and solid and pretty heavy. Not quite the Oxford 8's week. Okay, once you've got going though. Back home on the lawn, it's time for some footy practice. Southend United had finished the 48-49 season near the bottom of Division 3 South. Not much new there then. It's floral print frocks for all ages. Indoors in the wintertime, there's a different sort of family scene. Cosy evenings in front of the fire with the children playing Corinthian bagatelle. To play this properly, you've got to send the little balls round the board and add up your score from whatever pens they end up in. A bit like a steam age version of pinball. But when you're this age, it's much more fun just to put the balls anywhere. Isn't it funny how excited and energetic small children get when it's coming up to bedtime? There's a lovely fire in that grate. This family are lucky. Fuel shortages were a big problem in the late 1940s, made worse by the terrible winter of 1947, which ran the country's already meagre coal stocks down to zero. This time it's Dolly's turn for attention. Older brother isn't really interested in dolls at all, but he's happy to play along to get on camera. Little boys are much more interested in the Wild West. Bang, bang, I'm Roy Rogers, and who's going to be my horse Trigger? Well, guess who? Well done, Dad. And now look who's the horse. This mum's a real sport. Now Dad's going to be the baddie. Not much need for a disguise. Mexican, perhaps? Now here's the Toy Town Bank. And here's how not to rob it. Not a cent left. There'll be big trouble now. Watch out, the sheriff's got you. Better come quietly. All good family fun. In the 1940s, of course, there was no television to entertain us and no computers, only the wireless. On the other hand, most mums were usually at home, while Dad would get back from work in better time, shorter commutes and less traffic. And Granny often lived just along the road. So the family were usually all together before the children's bedtime, and many feel life was the better for it. Outside the family, scouting provided a supervised framework where boys could use their sense of adventure. Annual camp was fun for the leaders too, at least in weather like this. We trust they've got that fire going without matches. Wonder what that tea's like. No such thing as tea bags in 1949, and instant coffee was expensive and difficult to get. The basic duties of camp life use up plenty of energy. And for those with beans still to work off, how about a game of quoits? Now comes a rather different boys' activity. In 1948, a youth club in Burnley set out to write, act, shoot and produce an adventure film themselves. This project was the basis of their summer camp week on the rocky and romantic North Yorkshire coast. And as fans of the famous radio serial Dick Barton's Special Agent, they chose an adventure yarn about smuggling. Queer Fish, an excellent title for the tale that follows. The story opens in the little fishing village of Staithes. All the film was silent, of course, so they usually put music to it from a wind-up gramophone playing old 78 RPM records that the boys frantically changed to keep up the continuity. The locals entered into the spirit of the filming wholeheartedly. Here's our young hero checking his lobster pots. Youth club leader Alec Taylor ran a chemist's shop in Burnley and could get supplies of 8mm film at wholesale prices. Home cine cameras at that time were of course clockwork. Staithes is a very steep and atmospheric place, as anyone who's been there will know. Those are dogfish they're gutting. Now the story begins. Our hero, John, is selling fish door to door. Now is this chap all he seems to be? An offer of cigarettes. That's strange. A serious conversation here. A CID warrant card. There's smuggling afoot. The strange man shows John a drawing of a canister, the sort of thing that could be put into the sea with a lobster pot. Now is John intercepting someone else's traffic, or is he joining the smugglers himself? Inside the canister, a bundle of old-style fivers. Aha! Now enter the Blanktown Boys, alias Burnley St Stephen's Youth Club. A vintage shot here of the train coming into Staithes. The railway line here closed 10 years later in 1958. The lads will have to pile out quickly, no second chance to shoot this scene. A bit of slapstick coming up. The case of the missing ticket. The novel idea was to learn a little bit about the skills of acting, filmmaking, editing, and of course to have a little bit of fun in the process. At the end of the war, many ex-service billets quickly took on a new lease of life as holiday camps. More slapstick here. You can bet the boys rehearsed this scene all right. several times. First morning and off to explore. Hey, look, what's that? Looks like John, and he's in a bad way. See if he's got anything on him. A CID warrant. Let's get him back to camp. Hope he's not broken any bones. Look, what's this in the Daily Express? Another headline on the right says, "Now your money goes into films." Wonder if they realised that. And so John tells the lads his story. Here's John in his fishing cobble, a typical craft of these parts, and he doesn't want any passengers on board. The Blanktown boys are out in force. It's raincoats for all. Clearly the North Yorkshire weather was its usual dodgy self that summer. And up the street there's a confrontation. John's in trouble. The lads now seem to have taken against him. Next day the sun's back out, and so are the lads on the trail of their quarry again. Or is it a different quest this time? We've seen him before. It's our man from the CID, or so we thought. That moustache and haircut somehow make him look a wrong 'un, and rightly so. He's the villain after all, being warned that the game is up. Here's how criminals operated with yesterday's technology. You wired your contact by post office telegram, and you couldn't leave town till first train tomorrow, which in a place like Staithes wouldn't have been exactly at the crack of dawn. Here come the lads, hot on the trail. There goes John and the villain, and the lads give chase in another cobble. While today's teenagers might well find this story rather straightforward, for a generation used to undemanding radio plays and local pantomimes, this was pretty exciting stuff. Quick, there's the morning train. But the boys have got back on shore. Too late, gotcha! And, as in all the best thrillers, the villain ends up well and truly nicked. Some of those last action scenes wouldn't have been very easy to film, and the young amateurs, with their slim resources and old-fashioned kit, did a first-class job. Queerfish became known around the clubs of East Lancashire and earned several local showings, but it's never been seen by a wider audience. Until now. Further down the Yorkshire coast lies Firely, larger than Staithes, and a family resort as well as a fishing village. The Victorians built elegant terraces here, and the town, with its bracing air, became a retirement home for well-to-do textile barons from Yorkshire's West Riding. Here, in 1948, the town centre still had much of the character of the fishing village from which it grew. There's another Jowett Bradford van coming. Looks like a queue for the cinema. The big box office hit of the year was Moira Shearer in The Red Shoes, which went on to become an all-time classic. Filey has a 6-mile sweep of sands that make it ideal for seaside fun. The bay is sheltered from the north by Filey Brig, the rocky, mile-long headland in the background. The family heads for the beach, the ladies looking very British in their floral print frocks. In these post-war years, families were starting to get away for holidays together, often for the first time in a decade. Foreign travel was still for the rich few, so it was off to our own seaside and country, with fingers tightly crossed for decent weather. The Yorkshire coast was and is drier but colder than the south and west, but on this trip they're having it lucky. With petrol still on the ration, most of these holiday makers would have come to Filey by train for a week or a full fortnight. The town built a reputation as one of the more genteel resorts, and its hotels and boarding houses set out to offer quality rather than quantity. But there's no doubt that's a cheap pair of seaside sunglasses. The sea's warm enough to tempt at least some of the family in. Sun cream for tender skins. None of your various different factors in those days. It was Neurona or nothing. And with a towel over her head for shade, the knitting granny gives a passable imitation of a holidaying nun. Hurry up! The kids are getting bored with all these photo calls. It's lovely and warm in the shallows. There are the good old British rolled up trousers and the dress tucked into the knickers. Prison with ice cream. Well, that can only mean one thing. Something that had come into fashion shortly before the war and then had been put on hold, so to speak. Butlins Holiday Camp. These buildings look all too reminiscent of a very different kind of camp. But in fact, at that period, with people's expectations modest and with few alternatives, holiday camps became popular across the social range, with maybe a more upmarket image than today. House colours at Butlins were a cheerful sky blue and cream. No accident that ice cream vendors use the same colours. They make people think summer. The open-air swimming pool with its fountain was the outdoor centre of things. Craftily placed loudspeakers woke you up and kept you posted on the day's events, filling in between times with the latest hit tunes, Buttons and Bows, Slow Boat to China, the Woody Woodpecker song. This has got to be a swimming race. And so indeed it is, under the eye of an outsized clown. The Butlins Redcoat adjudicates. Several of Britain's top comedians cut their showbiz teeth as redcoats. Now we've gone black and white for a few moments. The camp shop must have run out of colour film. And while the children are safely supervised, the older folk can sit in the gardens and look forward to a cup of tea. Or maybe something a bit stronger. A pint of mild and bitter, or half and half, was a great favourite in the north. Very likely Tetley's of Leeds, popular then as now. Cheers! Scarborough, just up the coast from Filey, is a much bigger town. There's a local bus service, plus coach trips to attractions in the district, including Castle Howard. Scarborough's floral displays are famous. It's a spa town too, with mineral waters as well as bracing sands and promenades, and claims to be the oldest established seaside resort in Britain. The harbour, with its quay for ocean-going vessels, provides endless interest. Times have changed, but Britain's coast holds many happy holiday memories. Along with holidays, a favourite subject for home movies has always been weddings. This couple tied the knot in Eccleshill, Bradford, in the late 1940s, with everyone sporting the styles and fashions worn by wedding guests of the time. And this will be a rather better-known wedding. It's the 20th of November 1947, and the Royal Daimler is going on duty for the marriage of Princess Elizabeth, just turned 21, to a young naval officer, Lieutenant Philip Mountbatten, newly ennobled as the Duke of Edinburgh. It was the first outing since the war for the state coach and regalia, and the household cavalry is in full dress splendour. As the procession emerges from Admiralty Arch, crowds throng Whitehall on this grey November day for as far as the eye can see. Tens of thousands cheer and wave in front of Buckingham Palace. It was a Friday, and large numbers had clearly been given a day off work. From more than half a century ago, the grainy, monochrome image of our present Queen comes to us as from a different world. In everyday life, the British population were making the best of those days of shortages and slow reconstruction. It's funny face time for the girls in this garden as the family enjoys the summer sunshine. Remember how this is done? Hit your slow motion button to find out. Some prefer to take it easier. With such an active family, he's maybe thinking of the big event of the summer of '48, the Olympic Games held in London, dubbed the Austerity Olympics. It was the first time this 4-yearly event had been held since the Berlin Games of 1936, dominated by Hitler and the Nazis. This time, Germany, Japan and the Soviet Union were all absent. But the 1948 Games proved a great success and a real psychological boost for a shell-shocked world yearning for better times again. And here we are on the seafront at Brighton, with the sun shining and the gardens in bloom. By the look of the crowds, it's a weekend or maybe a bank holiday, with the town thronged with day trippers from London. There's a stiff breeze coming up the channel, and the tide's right in, but a few hardy souls are braving the waters. You need deck chairs here. Those pebble beaches are hard on the bones for laying out on. Dad seems to be putting his dressing gown to good use. Time to get ready for a swim. And in we go. Come on, it's lovely. And as more people join the party, see the seaside fashions of 1949. One-piece bathing costumes for both sexes and rubber bathing caps for the ladies, and some very white flesh on show. That ball is made from a thick rubberized material. You can almost smell it, not the light plastic kind you get today. Up on the promenade, rose gardens make a pleasant stroll for older folk. Behind stands the Westminster Bank Limited, long before its merger with the National Provincial to form NatWest. Holidaymakers staying here would have had to make prior arrangements to draw cash away from home. Folk on the pier sport a variety of headgear. At this period, most people still wore hats nearly all of the time. The young people cast their eye over the amusements. What on earth was the radio rifle, we wonder? That giant weighing machine would no doubt tell your fortune as well as your weight. And now, finally, to round off our look at life in the 1940s, a boat trip round the bay. That's an RNLI sweater the boatman's wearing, a reminder of how much our island race owes to its volunteer lifeboatmen. And our own white cliffs, symbol of an England still unconquered. We do hope you've enjoyed this exclusive look at life in the 1940s. As we've seen, this was a decade which, despite the shadow of the war, also had its lighter moments for many families. Be sure to look out for the other volumes in this unique series, which continues this look at everyday life throughout the 1930s and 50s. Bye for now. Hello and welcome to this unique look at everyday life in Britain during the 1950s. A decade characterised by change and growth, as well as hopes and fears, as Britain's post-war recovery gathered pace. As we shall see, although a few items, like sweets, were still rationed until 1953, this decade of gradually increasing prosperity was generally a time of great optimism. Home cine cameras, usually used to record special family events, were starting to become popular. And these rare films, produced mainly by talented amateur photographers, have been used to compile this unique look at everyday life in post-war Britain. New housing, begun soon after the war, was gobbling up greenfields round many a town. A mood of cautious optimism was gradually taking hold. Industry was getting back into its stride. Cars were also back on the road as petrol rationing ended. And new and better models were on the market. This young man is hugely proud of his brand new MG, a classic British sports thoroughbred. This is one of the MGTD series, built from 1949 to 1953, with a 1250cc engine and a top speed of 86 miles per hour. The MG's clean, simple lines are timeless. No wonder sports car enthusiasts still price them today. MGs were made here in Abingdon, a historic town that was then in Berkshire, but found itself in Oxfordshire when they moved the county boundaries in 1974. So too did nearby Appleford, where the National Traction Engine Rally was held in 1953. This splendid machine dates from 1921. Many engines of this vintage are still active at rallies today, half a century on. But when these scenes were filmed, a few steam engines, and especially steam rollers, could still be seen earning their living in everyday use. Home movie makers used to enjoy heading up their film diaries with title cards, such as this perky little graphic. The 13th of June 1953 was a big day for this family and their friends in Abingdon, as their daughter got married in St Michael's Church. But could anyone guess that more than 50 years later, their day would be replayed by thousands of new viewers? The groom arrives, apparently by Morris 8, as a hired Daimler stands down the road, and the groomsmen follow. The big moment. Our same filmmaker produced an almanac for 1954. Snow was uncommon enough to warrant getting the camera out. Today, for whatever reason, it's just as much of a novelty. Spring sunshine, and the crowds are back in Abingdon streets. Midgham was the scene of this motorbike scramble in April 1954. And off they go. Norton, Vincent, Ariel, Matchless, BSA. All the great names of British motorcycling in its heyday. This once great British industry has long since vanished, while Midgham now lies in the UK's own so-called Silicon Valley, where foreign-owned companies turn out computers and electronic goods. It's a different world. The organisers of this scramble were lucky with their sunshine. That summer of 1954 went on to be one of the worst ever recorded, with outdoor events cancelled, holidays washed out, and crops ruined across the country. Of course, the British love of horses and ponies was as strong as ever. This sizable turnout of motor cars, including quite a few new models, shows that by now prosperity was indeed returning. Peace, however, seemed always in the balance, with wars in Korea and Indochina, Russia ever menacing behind the Iron Curtain, and the threat of the H-bomb now looming over the world. People were determined to enjoy better times amid feelings that it might well not last. So Christmas was something like its old self, with money in people's pockets and plenty in the shops once more. This young lady is a baby boomer from the great surge in the birth rate that took place immediately after the war. And Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, first recorded in 1949, was top Christmas time seller for years afterwards. With rationing finally ended and prosperity on the up, people could once again afford to push the Christmas boat out and enjoy a family-sized turkey. Doesn't the cook look proud? And a cake too, with all the decorations. And the head of the household drinks to another year of rising fortunes. In those days, when Britain was much less urbanised, the Boxing Day hunt meet was very much the thing to go and see, even if you had nothing to do with hunting for the rest of the year. We're waiting for the Stirrup Cup. Ah, here we are, something good and warming to be sure. And off we go. Now, in May 1954, the world of sport, and the world in general, was stunned by the news that a young medical student from Oxford, Roger Bannister, had run a mile in under 4 minutes. Athletics clubs everywhere were galvanised into new activity as the scale of this feat sank in. A variety of decidedly pre-Reebok running kit takes to the track. Who could have guessed that sports gear and sport in general would become such a huge multinational fashion-orientated business? Back to less strenuous action now. This wedding from 1951 was in Blackpool, and on their way, these guests crossed a North Country ford in their own Ford, a Ford Prefect to be precise. Soon they passed the county boundary in the valley called the Trough of Bowland. Blackpool is feeling autumnal, and the illuminations are up. There are still some visitors around. And so the families gather to celebrate a very special occasion. Two brides looking forward to a lifetime of married bliss. For in 1951, marriages were expected to last, while few would have considered tying the knot anywhere but in church. The ladies' corsages are much more elaborate than we see today, and their bouquets much bigger. Everyone looks on tip-top form. This is a double-size wedding party. A bit of fun just before the wedding Wolseley leaves, well known in those days as a police car. That's a Daimler behind. And off go the second couple. Blackpool is the only British town to have had trams continuously from Victorian times through to today. But in the 1950s, several places still had their old-style systems, including Liverpool. This is actually the last week for Liverpool's trams, which finished for good on the 14th of September 1957. An early Morris Minor convertible approaches, with L-plates on. Just as this Victorian mode of transport was closing down, so the space age was beginning. For in less than a month's time, on the 4th of October 1957, the Russians would launch Sputnik 1, the world's very first man-made satellite. Across the Pennines in Leeds, trams lasted 2 years longer, the last cars running on the 7th of November 1959. The lead system had gone on expanding right up until after the Second World War. The last stretch to open, in August 1949, was the long route out to Middleton Park, much of it on a reserved right-of-way. Around 1950, Leeds bought a large batch of these trams, second-hand from London Transport, where the system was closing down. These city centre views show native Leeds four-wheel cars of an even earlier vintage. Passengers are wandering all over the road. Wow, watch that motorbike! The trams could negotiate surprisingly tight curves. The final big British city to operate trams was here in Glasgow, where the system lasted until September 1962. The three-tone colour scheme was a distinctive feature of the Glasgow fleet. It's noticeable how little other traffic is around in these city centre scenes. Ancient and modern tramcars together. Typical Glasgow tenement blocks stand behind as trams and a motorbus pass. After Glasgow closed in 1962, Blackpool was left as our only tram town for 30 years, till the first of the new generation systems opened in Manchester. The biggest national event for very many years was the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II in June 1953. Every town and village had its celebrations and parties, but London led the way with a stunning extravaganza of colour and festivity. Everyone had been longing for an end to the drab days of austerity which had dragged on since the war, and the crowning of a young queen in early summer seemed to signal a fresh start and new hope. Places were bustling again. The name on the hotel is that of a brewery. In those days, brewers owned many of England's better hotels, as well as pubs and inns. Shops were once again well stocked, and people had money to spend on gifts and nice things, as well as bare essentials. The open road led into the country. And the roads were properly signposted once more. During the war, road signs everywhere had been taken down, to confuse any potential invading Germans, and to help the drive for scrap metal to be made into tanks and guns. Those old-style signposts weren't all that easy to read, but they looked elegant. Ashford in Kent in the mid-1950s provides a fascinating glimpse of everyday life. Petrol at that time would have been around 3 and 6 a gallon. The local cinema hadn't yet been turned over to bingo. And every bus had a conductor. The girls are off to play tennis, while women stop for a chat. Nearby, this Bedford Dormobile stands on the hill. The train fare to London was about 9 bob single, just 45 pence. There's no chance the conductor will let those kids on with that inflated inner tube. Market day in Ashford, that means it's a Tuesday. Plenty of good fruit and veg here, No supermarkets then, of course. Not sure if those plums are ripe. Broccoli's lovely today, ma'am. There we are. That's 1 and 8 halfpenny altogether. Thank you very much. It's playtime now in a London park for the children of the 1950s. Carefree days in a sunny world, but a world that's changing now, faster and faster. There are exciting times ahead, and some scary ones too. Swings and slides are always fun, while at home there's new entertainment. Lots of people have got 8-shaped aerials fixed to their chimneys. That means they've got television. Can we watch Muffin the Mule today, please, Mum? Older brothers and sisters will be off down the road to meet at the new coffee bar with its espresso machine. They'll be listening to the jukebox, which plays those new small 7-inch records at 45 RPM. All the teenagers are buying them because rock and roll is here. Someone called Elvis Presley is in the charts, and Rock Around the Clock is on at the local Gaumont. Blue jeans are all the rage with teenage girls, though not the boys yet. Life for the grown-ups is getting steadily better. There are fridges and washing machines to help Mum do the housework, so she can have more time to play with the children, or even get a part-time job and boost the family income. Happy days are here again. And it's goodbye to an era at the 1955 general election, with 80-year-old Winston Churchill standing down as Prime Minister. But on the world horizon, things remain worrying. The dreaded dictator Stalin is dead, but communism rules Russia, and worse, China, as the Cold War intensifies. And national service still lies ahead for lads reaching 18. So, what will these boys want to be when they grow up? Very likely an engine driver. It's still very much the age of steam. These trains are on the main line from King's Cross to the north. This used to be the LNER, but in 1948 they had all become British Railways in the Attlee government's great nationalisation programme. This, however, is a thoroughbred LNER streamliner built in the 1930s. Then, as now, opinions were sharply divided about British Railways. The whole system had become very badly run down during the war and stood in dire need of heavy investment and confident management. Instead, it got political meddling and an extremely hostile press. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? This handsome locomotive was the first to be designed by the new British Railways engineering team. It was built in 1951 with the patriotic name Britannia, and one of its sisters was an exhibit at the Festival of Britain that year on London's South Bank. Politics or no, an engine driver was what thousands of young boys still wanted to be. The thrill of being in charge of such a large and living machine had an appeal of its own. That's the water going in. Before every run, there's oiling round to be done. Skimp on this and you're in trouble. The fireman's busy too. Preparation is a two-man job. Have I got this one? Train spotting was in its heyday, with clubs all round the country encouraging boys to take an intelligent interest in how the railways ran. The snide jokes about train spotting and anoraks only started much later. Not many home movie makers managed to get a working ride on a steam engine, but here's one who did. It's August 1955, and the train is about to leave Liverpool Street Station in London. An express driver's job is a highly skilled one, with a rate of pay to match. But over the years, other railway grades tended to catch up with drivers' wages, and earlier this same summer, 1955, the Locomen's Union, ASLEF, had gone on strike for nearly 3 weeks over this question of pay differentials. They did eventually win a sort of victory, but the effects of the strike were disastrous. With road transport of all kinds booming, the railways had been losing traffic steadily, but the strike of '55 lost them a whole lot more in one fell swoop, especially freight contracts. Many of those customers never came back. Soon the steam engines would be replaced by diesels, but the heyday of the railways was passing, and the 1950s were a story of mounting losses and more closures, particularly branch lines. It would be more than 20 years before things stabilised. But even today, the railway's image and political problems loom as large as they did half a century ago. Back at home, it's 1956, and a proud family filmed this record of their young son at their new house at Flimwell, on the borders of Sussex and Kent. When you're learning to walk, that tussocky grass takes some negotiating. Dad's in his business suit. Must have found some excuse to nip off home for an hour. This is a new bungalow with the garden not yet made. A bit more space than some new houses have today. Come the summer, and young David makes his first trip to the coast. Wrap up well, the summer of '56 was another shocker, nearly as bad as '54. The grass at home is bad enough, but this shingle is something else. Whoa! Look, pebbles! Everybody well togged up? Right. So, with the family Austin in the background, young David goes for a stroll along the seafront. A couple of months later, and it's time for a bike ride. Those toddler seats were very popular at one time. Not much of a forward view for the passenger, and nothing to stop young legs or clothes from catching in the spokes. It's fun up here. Thanks for the help, Granny. I'll just check the car to see everything's okay. That's fine. There's so much for a toddler to do. Even a train ride. Not a real steam engine though, that's cheating. August a year later, and a new addition to the family. A lot more hard work ahead for Mum. No disposable nappies in those days. It'll soon be time for Farley's rusks. And so to Christmas 1957. The family's done itself proud with the decorations. Time to reflect on the year gone by. It had started with big news, with Prime Minister Anthony Eden resigning over the Suez fiasco and Harold Macmillan, Supermac, taking over. The older generation wondered what had hit them every time they put the light programme on. Not just rock and roll now, but skiffle, Lonnie Donegan and co, with guitars, washboards and T-chest bass. Never mind, it's all good fun and the youngsters are loving it. There's plenty on the Christmas table. We could do with winning something now on these new premium bonds. We've had yet another cold, soggy summer, but we took the car to Devon for a couple of weeks in August. Traffic was terrible around Exeter. And there's Babysham, Tizer, Mackerson, and a bottle of rather sweet white wine. A real treat, that. Full to, everybody. Who can resist Yorkshire puddings, even with the Christmas dinner? Mum's still got her pinny on. Lots of mums seem to live in pinnies in those days. It's lovely to relax afterwards with a cigarette. Yes, 57's been quite a year. We've only just got over this dreadful Asian flu that shut all the schools down. And now all the other winter ills are here again. Our eldest's having to spend Christmas in bed, poor thing, with a really nasty cold and temperature. Brother and sister have gone up after dinner to try and cheer him up. Ah well, he'll soon be over it. In the meantime, let's have a dance. Whiskey, anyone? Johnny Walker? Booth's Gin and Tonic? Or perhaps Dry Fly Sherry? Just a last cigarette, Jim, and then we really must be going. It's been absolutely lovely again, dear. Our turn next year. You two have been up since 5 o'clock. And I could do with bed too. And now to the world of work, where Lokes and Pettit were building contractors in Thrapston in Northamptonshire. A Ford Popular rolls up for start of work. Then this Hillman Minx. Here's the postie, bringing the bills and hopefully some new orders. Accounts have been to the bank for the wages. Always 2 people for security. There's a GPO telephone van. No BT in those days. In the joinery shop, door and window frames are under construction. The boss discusses the job in hand. The office keeps the book straight with pen, paper and typewriter. No hint of a calculator, and computers were still light years in the future. Meanwhile, bagged cement is being delivered. And petrol for the firm's vehicles. Out on site, they're laying tarmac. It's certainly well graded. Looks like an all-weather tennis court. Some of the lads out on site might be able to nip off to a cafe for a break. A lot of the customers here will be lorry drivers. The menu offers various combinations of sausages, baked beans, eggs, tomato, chips, and of course bacon butties, always top of the bill. We're busy this evening. These workmen's cafes gave very good value for money, as indeed they still do. 1 and 6 in the late 50s, 7.5p as it is now, would get you a huge plateful, plus a good hunk of bread and butter. And of course, plenty of tea, strong enough to stand your spoon in. Here's the lads from the railway depot coming in. These greasy spoons undoubtedly help to keep the wheels of Britain turning. The 1950s were boom years in the property and building world, with people moving up the housing ladder as standards of living rose. Vacant lots between earlier houses went up for sale. This one is in Essex, and an architect comes to meet the purchaser to discuss a new project. Rather unusually, this new plot is actually next door to the owner's existing property. This piece of rough land will soon be a home, a classic piece of infill building. Today, in a residential area, a plot this size would carry 2 or maybe 3 new houses. With a bit of fine weather, work can start on the services and foundations. Drain pipes are earthenware, not plastic. Bricklayers wear trousers, waistcoat, shirt and tie. Soon, door and window frames are in place. The builders are also trading as undertakers. This used to be quite common among small firms which had the facilities to construct coffins. Today, people expect a rather more sophisticated approach to death. Undertakers have become funeral directors, and the building trade has exited the field, as business jargon has it. Wonder if the builders are whistling "This Old House," a huge hit for Rosemary Clooney in 1954. Construction is finished and a wood parquet floor is going down. That'll help the house command a good price if it's still there today. A dustette gets up the grit, a miniature handheld hoover once found in every housewife's cupboard. Next, filling up the wallpapering machine. The paper must be absolutely flat and straight. If you've ever tried to do wallpapering yourself and had a few problems, watch this and eat your heart out. That pattern may not be to today's taste, but the application is truly professional. And we trim it off, so. On the ceiling, the machine is even more of a boon. Was he still at it when the furniture van arrived? Well, maybe not. But here's a handsome 4-bed detached, brand new as built, and now becoming a home as the family and their possessions move in. The motorbike's left at the gate. It's the 1950s, and most ordinary houses had no garage. In the cities, of course, none of the older houses had garages, but then hardly anybody yet had cars. Kids and their mums could play safely in the empty streets. And so could the dog. That's a prefab on the left. And what about this for a lot of fun? Made of bits of wood and old pram wheels. Just how many balls is she bouncing? Off to the shop on an errand for Mum. One thing that certainly survived the war was the community spirit in these close-knit communities. The girls are at the doorway of that prefab. Come on, we're on film. Word quickly gets round. The little one's in his coach pram with a real thick blanket. This little chap's certainly been drinking his Lucozade. And a quick kick around before Dad goes off to work. This lucky family's got a new Mini. The Morris Mini Minor, to give it its full name, was introduced in 1959, but didn't actually take off straight away. But it was great fun to drive and handle superbly, and went on to become one of the defining cars of the 20th century. The shops in the 1950s high street weren't all the same main names we always find today. The staff are having a bit of a laugh. While in the playground, the little ones amuse themselves. Smoking was just something that grown-ups did, without any thought for health. Health and safety wasn't an issue either. Children at play expected to get scratches and knocks. Today, this playground would no doubt be surfaced with non-slip, soft surface material. No such concerns though at Ifield Grammar School in Crawley, where the Mayfair was a useful fundraiser. Piles of hand-me-down kiddies' clothes here. On a Saturday afternoon, it's a nice change for the staff from marking exercise books. They seem to have had a reasonable day for it. It would have been a shame if everything had to be moved into the classrooms. Even so, some of the older folks still wear hat, gloves and overcoat. But not now, they don't. We're on holiday at the seaside, and after a run of dreadful summers, the year 1959 turned up trumps with week after week of glorious sunshine. The castle construction business is in full swing. British holidaymakers now had plenty of money in their pockets, but going abroad was still out of range for most, especially those with children. So our own resorts reaped the benefit. Hot and cold in all rooms was now the rule, rather than the exception at your hotel, though that just meant wash basins. Ensuite bathrooms would be for the next generation. It's a bit late for that. They're already full of sand. As soon as the tide leaves room, a traditional Punch and Judy show sets up. It's only glove puppets, but the little ones love it. Punch and Judy is actually an old Italian tradition. With all that bashing women over the head, it's not very politically correct these days. The little ones love pony rides too. There's a miniature fun fair on the beach. Of course, no visit would be complete without some souvenir rock. And the good old helter-skelter, up they go! And down they come. Caravans were becoming more and more popular. Now you could take a self-catering apartment with you to your favourite holiday spot. Earlier caravans like this one were quite small, if only because pre-war cars hadn't been strong or reliable enough to tow anything heavier. Much bigger and better vans came on the market in the 1950s, with room for a family in some comfort. Lots of campsite owners hired out fun bicycles like this and earned a bit extra. There's a Jowett Javelin in the background as this family take to the road, or at least the lane. It looks quite hard work. Hey, there's Andy Capp. A sailing vessel lies in the channel in this view of Ilfracombe in North Devon. Ilfracombe expanded rapidly in Victorian times, with both railway and steamer services, and substantial buildings went up around the harbour. The coastal walks and scenery around here are some of the finest in England. This ornate Victorian weighing machine stands on the headland. Not something you'd find with today's planning regulations. Since the 1950s, holidaying has moved on. The railway has closed, but the scenery remains as fine as ever, and Ilfracombe still attracts plenty of visitors. Further north, the Lake District, then as now, was among England's top holiday choices. Ancient inns had been joined by Victorian hotels in catering for the visitors who'd been flocking here for 2 centuries and more. By this time, motor traffic was already a problem in narrow streets and lanes. Despite one-way systems, it's not any better today. In the 1950s, the thing that would really transform holidays, mass air travel, had yet to take off, so to speak. Heathrow Airport was in its infancy. Commercial flying was still largely by propeller aircraft. BEA, British European Airways, would later merge with BOAC to form British Airways. One of the best-known aircraft of the time was the Vickers Viscount. Seating just 53 passengers, the Viscount cruised at 300 miles an hour at 20,000 feet, low and slow by today's standards. Just as on the roads, it's noticeable how little traffic there is. It's a glorious day in London town now, as Waterloo Bridge spans Old Father Thames at high water. Almost none of today's tall buildings are yet in existence. On the South Bank, redevelopment is busily making good the devastation of the Blitz. Behind Charing Cross Bridge stands the Royal Festival Hall, opened for the Festival of Britain in 1951. The London Eye stands here today. County Hall, as was, today is a hotel. An elderly cargo steamer comes by as we take a trip on the river ourselves. First we head downstream towards the docks. Ships from all over the globe line the banks of London's mighty river, the very heart of the world's greatest trading nation. Cranes by the hundred mark the Isle of Dogs, reborn today as Docklands. Upstream now to Battersea Power Station, only just completed when this film was shot in the mid-1950s. Built to burn coal brought in by sea, Battersea had a working life of just 30 years. The building has since defied all attempts to put it to a good permanent use. You can indeed sail in the middle of London. All aboard now for a trip to another dock, this time the home of the great Cunard liners at Southampton. At the quayside, the first Queen Elizabeth, for most of her life the largest ship afloat at over 83,000 tons. Launched on the Clyde in 1938, this great liner was almost immediately called to serve as a troop ship, carrying 15,000 men at a time, before going on the North Atlantic run and cruising until 1968. 4 years later, she caught fire and sank in Hong Kong harbour during refitting as a floating university and was eventually broken up. Of course, it wasn't only the British Merchant Navy that ruled the waves in the 1950s. Our Royal Navy still numbered its fleet in the hundreds, and its duties were worldwide. This record was made by a serving crew member of the aircraft carrier HMS Victorious, on exercises in African waters. First commissioned in 1941, Victorious underwent a major refit in 1958 so as to operate jet aircraft, and this was the first tour of duty in her new guise. A destroyer sailing alongside feels the swell. A line is rigged between the two vessels for the transfer of goods. Careful navigation is more than usually vital. During extended tours away from home, boredom can be the worst enemy, and keeping up morale among Victorious' 2,000 men was a top priority. All the Royal Navy's aircraft are operated by the Fleet Air Arm, a service whose skills remain unrivalled. At this stage, Victorious was operating a mixed fleet of jet and propeller aircraft. Manoeuvring on the hangar deck is a precision exercise with either mode of propulsion. In 1958, the British Commonwealth still stretched across the globe. But the Suez debacle 2 years earlier had really marked the end of our superpower status. Thereafter, changed politics and new technology meant that the role of the Navy grew steadily smaller. Numbers of men under arms also shrank considerably with the end of national service in 1959. The cost of supplying and maintaining this worldwide presence was also proving beyond Britain's means in the New World Order. HMS Victorious was finally decommissioned in 1969. We're back in Civvy Street once more, as two young fellows head for the family kitchen. That wallpaper's the kind of thing you might still discover today, under several other layers if you're stripping off before redecorating. Mum's busy ironing. It looks rather hard going. This was in the days before steam irons, and if the clothes were too dry, those creases just wouldn't come out. Now there's knitting to get on with. That blue nylon housecoat's a sign of times past. In the corner, there's a flickering black and white image on the cabinet television set. In the late 50s, women's programs were on around lunchtime. Then both channels shut down until early evening. Another day and wakey wakey! I'm going on a picnic today. Here's the family standard 8. Children in the front? No problem, and no seat belts either. Heavy traffic here. Hillman Minks, Austin 7, Ford Anglia, and an old Wolseley on the right. Looks like fruit squash and jam sandwiches for everyone. Back at home, the ladies show off their latest new dresses for the camera. And for once, Dad isn't wearing a tie. A GB sticker shows that this family have taken their Austin A35 abroad. Before the days of the Euro and cheap cross-channel travel, this could be quite an adventure. More glorious weather from the summer of '59 as hundreds of families with their cars enjoy a day out. Car ownership was now starting to dictate the whole shape of British life. They still cost some though. That Austin we saw would be about £700 new, about 1.5 times a secondary school teacher's annual salary. The sunshine of '59 lasted right through to October and was widely credited with winning that month's general election for the government in power, when Prime Minister Harold Macmillan made the famous remark, "You've never had it so good." That made it 3 in a row for the Conservatives, And that's how things were as the 1950s drew to a close. Finally, a little film about family life made by a fond dad in the 1950s, which was designed to tell its own story without voiceover. So here goes. Oh dear, boys will be boys. True in the 1950s and true today. But are children still sent to bed anymore when they've been naughty? Let's hope they've a seaside holiday to dream about. We do hope you've enjoyed this look at British life in the 1950s. Be sure to look out for the other volumes in this unique series, which feature everyday activities throughout the 1930s and 40s. Bye for now.